Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast designed to help coach you up in your faith. The more you know, the more you can grow. The importance of growing your faith is more critical now than ever, and this is why you should invite people to be part of the Salty Pastor Podcast. My name is Jesse Mayer. I'll be your host, but we cannot do this without the Salty Pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peake.
Hey, everybody. Good to be with you today. We've really been digging into some of the more specific issues that people deal with for our series, Weeds in Our Garden. And, you know, we've kind of really had to dig in on Tuesday on the issue of suicide. And I really wanted to spend Tuesday focusing on kind of the biblical underpinnings of how to look at it in the proper frame of reference. And so I think we were able to do that. And I think that, you know, now we can kind of expand our discussion. But if you are being impacted or affected by the Salty Pastor in any way, shape, or form, would you help us grow this ministry by jumping on our YouTube channel and liking and subscribing? Because that really makes a big difference. So they say the first 1,000 is the hardest to get, but hopefully you and the Salty Pastor crew are out there. The old Salty crew is out there doing their thing. So we appreciate you so much in the expansion of this ministry, and we feel it's necessary to help cut through all the noise that's out there, and you can be a part of its growth. So thank you.
Well, and we talked about on Tuesday some stats. You laid out quite a few stats about how prevalent this particular topic of suicide is. Mm-hmm. So if we can be somebody who's speaking into the darkness on how to help be part of the solution, we want to spread that, and you guys can help us do that with that like and subscribe, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
When we started this series, we knew we were going to be talking about some pretty important things that many people are really just uncomfortable talking about. And on Tuesday's podcast, I thought it was really exceptional that we dug into those biblical perspectives, like you said, and we're developing clarity over this issue. And I think that's going to be really helpful for a lot of people. And then on today's episode, we're going to dig into the practical ways that you can help someone who is dealing with this issue. Or if you're dealing with yourself, what resources exist to help you. So I want to dive into that as well, because the biblical perspective helps us kind of see the spiritual bucket. We're using this bucket analogy throughout this series. Today's going to be focused kind of on the other three of how do we practically work on this particular subject. So,
yeah, and I think in a conversation before our podcast, you and I were talking about that we also want to help people who have been left behind. Yeah. You know, they're in the wake of this tragedy. How do they deal with that?
Yes.
You know, and these are all things that we really need to cover. First, let's remember the biblical perspective on suicide. When a person takes their own life, the scripture sees this as a failure. In a general sense, you could call it a sin. But we'd like to further state that the reason suicide is wrong is because it flows out of a false identity, right? In other words, a person begins to believe that would be better off if they were gone, which is false, right? They believe that they have no value anymore. Well, this is false. They lose hope that their life could have any significance. They believe things that in their darkest days could never get better or change. Well, this is all false. These are things that I believe Satan uses to convince a person that the only recourse in their life is to take their life. And the most important stats I want to point out about suicide are this. 90% of all people who want to go down that path but don't recover from all of the factors that were driving them to consider suicide. So there's a 90% success rate of recovery. And so basically that means persevering, holding on, results in a 90% chance of success. So there is hope for you, or there's hope for someone close to you. And if you kind of are in the wake of, you know, of being left behind, of a parent or a sibling or a friend that committed suicide, guess what? You have a 90% chance of succeeding and overcoming the factors that drove them to that decision if you simply hang on, and if you simply reach out, and if you receive help, and you let people know you need community. And so I think those are some important things to understand before we get into this discussion and all the resources, is that it's really important to know when to open yourself up to help. It's important to know how to persevere. It's important to know what signs to look for in yourself and in the people around you, and then to actually have easy access to immediate resources for whatever situation you might be in.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, we use this phrase a lot in this series, which is we want to provide help and hope, right?
Yes.
And there is hope. We're going to be talking about a lot of help things, but the hope thing is just as important, because if you don't see hope at the end of the tunnel, if the person who's thinking about it, or if you are, or even if you've lost someone, if you don't see that there's hope or that God's near to you, I mean, God knows what it's like to lose a child, right? Like there's this thing that we need to remember, that there is hope at the end of this, right? And if you don't hold on to that, if you're not pushing people towards that, they're not going to want to go through the process of help, right? Because it's too much work. It's going to be hard. And this help is very good, and it can be helpful, but if there's no hope, the desire to persevere,
That's right,
the desire to push on, if that doesn't exist, then it's going to be really hard to try to want to get the help.
There's all those things that exist to basically inspire hope.
Yeah.
And we need to avail ourselves of those things.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the factors or the signs. I want to be really practical in this. Factors or signs that we should be looking for that push people to consider suicide as an option.
Okay, yeah, and we're going to talk about these signs, contributing factors, risk factors, and then what signs to look for. But before I do that, I just want to say, during our research for this series, we came across a really great organization called Connection is the Key. It's an organization that was started by September Frogley, and the reason she started this organization is because she lost her brother to suicide, and it was primarily driven by substance abuse. She was really close to her brother, so she experienced firsthand all of these factors and what drives people towards choosing this option. So she formed the organization. We'd like to highlight them.
And that's Connection is the Cure, not the Key.
I'm sorry, Connection is a Cure. Yeah, thank you for getting me straight. Connection is a Cure, and what they just have a really great resource, and they're kind of a middleman between people who are hurting or in need, and then all the resources that exist.
They want to be. They're not a middleman to stop people from getting to resources. They're a middleman to try to connect you to resources.
Exactly.
Right?
They're a one-stop shop, which is awesome.
Yes.
Because they can kind of tailor make it to you. So, and so in our work with Connection is the Cure, we looked at how some of the risk factors risk factors are important to know, because it gives you a sense of proclivity.
Right.
Well, I'm going to be more sensitive to this issue than someone else, depending upon how many risk factors I have.
Or if you know someone who has a lot of these, then I should be paying a little more attention maybe for something like this.
Yeah, and so number one is has there been a prior suicide attempt? That's the single most important factor for suicide in the general population. And as a matter of fact, according to Connection is the Cure, it is 37 times more likely to succeed the second time a person tries. Number two, a huge factor is alcohol or drug abuse.
Okay.
All right. So so it's really hard to separate the issue of suicide from substance abuse. It's very, very difficult. Number three, diagnosable mental health disorder. Of course, this whole series is focusing on what?
Mental health.
Mental health. So diagnosable mental health disorders mean that it presents enough that it can actually be diagnosed. It can be recognized and seen.
Well, and one of the major blessings of this series is if you are able to help someone, or if you know now through this series, I'm dealing with this particular mental health thing, you also know that you potentially have a proclivity towards this, and so you can put safeguards in place if that's something that you are
Exactly.
And so that's a lot of people I'm assuming are wondering, why are you starting with the hardest, deepest topic, right? Like they're probably going, well, you couldn't have like warmed up with like anxiety or like
shouldn't we got a little warm
burnout?
up?
But what we're saying is suicide is a potential end part of undiagnosed or untreated mental health problems, and we want to make sure we're talking about the potential end stop that people sometimes choose before we even get into the rest of the stuff, because this is the thing we're trying to avoid.
And it also points to the fact why the clinical bucket is so important to know and understand and embrace.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we've talked often how, in leading into this series, of how in a lot of helping professions and a lot of our society, they focus on the biological, clinical, and situational, but they ignore the spiritual, right? Well, the problem is that sometimes the shoe's on the other foot, and if you're very attuned to the spiritual bucket, you can streamline causal distinctions and basically forget about the need for the clinical bucket.
Right.
And that's,
you don't want to swing the pendulum too far the other way.
That's just as dangerous. You know, let's not commit the same mistake, just in the opposite direction. Let's make sure that we are people who are filled with wisdom, we're filled with the knowledge, and we understand how the kingdom of God interacts with the kingdom of this world and how it works. That's really important to grasp all that. So diagnosable mental health disorders is important. And even though ultimately I think it's true that a spiritual cause or spiritual influence exists for a lot of mental health disorders, that doesn't mean that they don't need to be diagnosed and treated and all. You know what I'm saying? It's very specific. You need to be involved. Easy access to lethal methods. Our society is a huge risk factor, and of course that's just going to get more and more and more. Family history of suicide or a family history of violence. So if you grew up in a family that was really violent, or if you grew up and have a family history of suicide, that's a risk factor. Here's a really big one: a lack of social connection. A few. Gosh, I don't know if it was about 6 months ago, 9 months ago, or what we were talking about how the trend in American society is towards isolation and loneliness, right? That we're becoming more isolated people, and that's one of the contributing factors. It's a risk factor. So when somebody...
And we talked about how the stats are skyrocketing in suicide, and it's probably a solid correlation of people getting more isolated, and we're seeing an increase in this particular.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I mean, there is a loss of a family member or friend, especially if they committed suicide. So this is a social contagion thing, which is really quite fascinating to me. There's been some research on it, but I think that research has been really lacking. It's insufficient because the one thing that's what's so interesting about science is that, you know, science can study and prove a lot of things, but science cannot study and prove love.
Right. It
can study the effects of love. But the other thing that science is really interesting, if you talk to scientists, particularly theoretical neurologists and stuff like that, and that is when you get down to brass tacks, they can say, okay, here's the effect of consciousness, here's the effect of sentience, and here's this, that, and the other. But when you actually ask a question, where does sentience or where does consciousness come from? You know what their answer is?
Oh.
We have no idea. We have no idea. You know, it's not technically located in the center of a brain. And the reason they say this is we have no idea is because they think, oh, well, it's in this lobe of the brain. And then somebody is born without that lobe, or somebody loses it as a child in a head injury, and yet they're still conscious and sentient.
Right.
And so it's really, oh my goodness. So anyway, but that's why it's really difficult for them to study social contagion, because I believe that social contagion has a massive spiritual component to it.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's very difficult to study. If you have physical health problems like chronic pain or a traumatic brain injury, if you have relationship or school problems, this is always a big deal. One of the reasons why I think that you need to watch for risk factors, I think it's prevalent among females and young males, is that because our society's become so sexually open and sexually promiscuous, right, is that, 50% of teenagers, which means 50% aren't, but 50% of teenagers are having sex, right? And the problem is that we reserve sex and sexual intimacy for people who are older, because when you're a teenager, you're not emotionally able to understand what sexual intimacy does to you. It's not just sex, right? It creates a massive amount of bonding, a
Right.
massive amount of this. So what happens is then in high school when there's a breakup, it's absolutely devastating.
Right. You hear about, this idea of, well, it's just a breakup, like get over it. But when you add these new layers of sexual intimacy into it, there's a chemical reaction that's literally happening. So it's like you can't just say, well, get over it. Like there was bonding that occurred.
Exactly.
That's beyond what if you were choosing not to be sexually intimate, that bonding doesn't occur. So yeah, you can kind of be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, it was just a breakup, right? And
exactly.
There's a little more rationale involved versus there's literally a chemical reaction and an emotional bond that occurred when sexual intimacy enters
and everybody
the relationship.
knows this, I mean, women know this, with their girlfriends. They're like, when they start dating a guy and they're talking to their girlfriends and everything, and then it doesn't work out, they break out, they break up. They always ask, well, were you sleeping with him or not? Because they know that the seriousness of the breakup and the longevity of getting over it and all this stuff is going to be so much more intense if there was, like you just said, that physical bonding. That's why I think relationship or school problems are factors that need to be watched. And on top of that, there's stressful life events, stressful loss. These are all risk factors.
So I want to run through those really quick because we took a couple detours during that. So I just want to quick list just so everyone can have this available if they want to scroll back through this to listen again. That's again, if there was a previous suicide attempt, that's a risk factor. Alcohol or drug abuse, risk factor. Diagnosable mental health disorder is a risk factor. Easy access to lethal methods. If there's a family history of suicide or violence. Lack of social connection, loss of a family member or a friend, especially if it's by suicide. Physical health problems like chronic pain or traumatic brain injuries, relationship or school problems, and stressful life events or loss.
Yeah, and so I think the first step in understanding this is that, okay, you look for risk factors.
Right.
So
what's their proclivity?
Yeah, when the situation changes. So you look for risk factors. Now, if someone, has one risk factor, that doesn't mean that you go from 0 to 100 miles an hour right away. But you go, okay, now that I know there are risk factors, I should, bing, my radar goes up. I need to look for warning signs. Okay. So once there's 2, 3, 4, 5 risk factors, immediately watch for warning signs. That's important to do. And so what are the warning signs? Well, according to Connection is the Cure, they have a number. Number one is you look for a sense of hopelessness or there's no hope for the future, right? So you look for that. Now, how do you look for that? Well, you ask questions about, are you feeling, well, do you feel like this will get better tomorrow? You don't say to a person when you're looking for a warning sign, let's say they have a relationship breakup that's just devastating or a school problem or a lack of social connection, don't go to them and say, wow, I'm afraid that you're going to do something dumb, so don't forget there's always hope.
Right.
See, that's not a good approach, okay? The key is to go in and go, well, do you feel like things will ever get better? Because what you're doing is you want to probe and look for signs, right? Initially, to know how to respond. You look for, well, how lonely do you feel? I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, how isolated? Do you feel like you're in this all alone?
Right.
Look for aggressiveness and irritability. This is more for males than females. I mean, it will present in females, but I think it's more for males because the issue is that men deal with emotional trauma, mental illness differently than women. And I think one of the things that is really important to understand is males need to feel a sense of power and in control to overcome. So, and when we tell men, well, you just need to open up and talk about your feelings, this is counterproductive in my opinion. And the reason why is because it's their feelings that are out of control, right? And so what you're doing is you're saying, we'll talk about this thing that you're totally out. So what it does is just enhance their sense of lack of control, right? So, but you look for that. You look for aggressiveness and irritability. Do they feel like a burden? You call them, check on them, and they say, don't worry about me. What's going on with you? This is really important for teenagers. Do you see drastic changes in mood and behavior? Right? Do you see drastic mood changes? Do people, particularly teenagers, develop an obsession with death? Okay. Another thing is self-harm, cutting, self-harm, those types of things. Do they start engaging in more risky behaviors? And I think that's important. Do people, particularly if they're adults, if they're males, and they start giving things away? Oh, it's my favorite shotgun. This is my favorite gun. This is my favorite this. They start giving really significant things away. That's not a good sign. Substance abuse, of course, is huge contributing factor. Another factor or warning sign that you should look for is if they make suicidal threats or they have a very negative view of themselves and they start saying things like, it'd be better off if I wasn't around. These are warning signs that you should look for. And I think, you have to take them into account and really make sure that wow, if I have more than one of these warning signs, then I need to put a strategy together quickly for myself, right? Before I fall into this despair, or for those around you, right? And the other thing I want to say in regards to this too is whenever we talk about this, if you know somebody that's committed suicide, someone who is close to you, and you hear these warning signs, you're going to think to yourself, why didn't I see them? Or I saw them. Why didn't I do something about it? Why couldn't I have been there when they needed me the most? Why didn't I show up? Well, the bottom line on this, my friend, is that's guilt, right? As if you're in control of the universe and you're not. You're just not. And so, you did see these things, you process them appropriately. And so you can't sit there and go, wow, if I had been smarter or quicker or funnier or present or whatever, that person wouldn't have done that. You can't take responsibility for their choice.
Yeah, you have to let go of that guilt and shame.
You have to let go of it.
I mean, you don't have control over their final things, their final choices that they make, right?
Right.
Satan is going to use that as a playground for his work, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You feel isolated. You're gonna feel this shame and this pain, and he will use it to get you so twisted up on things you could have done differently or things you should have seen. But ultimately, that's not what God wants for you, right? And you don't have to own that choice that they made.
Right.
You can miss them. I think that there's
well, that's grief. You're going to have a lot of grief.
There's going to be grief, but you can't own that shame or guilt because, that's where Satan's going to really do his worst work, is in those people who are left behind. He's going to try to convince them that they could have done something different. And ultimately, those people made a choice and there's great loss. But ultimately, you also have to understand that God loves you, that you don't have to carry that guilt and shame.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And and the question then becomes is, well, if you have somebody in your circle or you see in yourself risk factors, right? And then you see the warning signs, okay, now I'm concerned, what do I do? And I think one of the things is that you might hear somebody, you have a conversation with them. You might hear words like, hey, I'm really tired. I just can't go on. Maybe they might say something like, my family's better off without me. Or they might say, who cares if I'm dead anyway? I just want out. I'm not going to be around much longer. Pretty soon nobody's going to have to worry about me. And I think one of the things that suicide counselors and trainers say is that you should always address the person by saying the word suicide.
Yeah.
You should always do that. You should say something like, are you thinking of suicide?
Don't talk about it like in a roundabout way where you're kind of being like, well, are you thinking about hurting yourself?
Right.
Or things of those natures. Those don't help, right?
Those don't help. They say that
vagary does not help.
Vagary does not help. Yeah. We say fluff is not enough. And this is definitely a case where that is so true. You have to say, are you thinking of suicide? Are you contemplating suicide? you could say something like, sometimes when people feel what you just said, they're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about it? Or how many times have you thought about it?
Right.
Kind of a thing. Is it suicide tormenting you right now? The desire to commit suicide? I think these are all questions that are really, really important.
And if there is a yes to one of those questions,
Oh yeah,
you need to call 911. It's better to be safe than sorry, and you need to just tell the dispatcher if there's a yes to, have you decided when you're going to kill yourself, or are you thinking about committing suicide?
Mm-hmm.
That's not let's just wait and hopefully they'll kind of work their way out of it. If they're at that point, they're needing some help. And
you make immediate call, suicide hotline.
That's
911,
988.
988
is suicide hotline. But I mean, if they're basically like, you're getting a sense that this is like an immediate thing, I would almost
you can call 911,
Yep.
and as soon as they know what's going on, they know how to route you to 988.
Yes.
It's all linked together.
Yeah.
So, which is really nice. But that's one option, obviously, to talk about. But I think the other thing, too, is to show how many resources are out there. There's lots of resources.
Yeah.
What I like about Connection is a Cure is that they're familiar with all of these resources. So instead of having to remember, like, which one, you just go to them and then they can help point you. But some that, I think are really important, really critical is it's called ISPH, and
Idaho Suicide Prevention Hotline.
Yep. And it's available 24/7. It is manned by crisis-trained volunteers. So they're volunteers, but they've been trained in crisis counseling. They are supervised by licensed counselors, social workers, and people with extensive experience in crisis intervention. It's good for any age, right? And especially for military. They have veterans,
who volunteer
and talk specifically, so they understand the specific stretches.
Veteran, right?
Veteran to veteran.
And I think that's important. Another one is the Pathways Community Crisis Center. That's also manned by social workers, counselors, and EMTs. You do have to be 18 years or older for that one, for admittance to that.
Yeah.
And you can only be voluntarily held there, but I mean, you can stay for up to a day basically at a time, and it's open 7 days a week. They have a lot of options for that, but that's great for if you're in crisis.
So
it's
like
a day hold.
If
basically.
it's a day hold, and so what you can do is if you have a friend or even yourself, you just go to this place, and they go, come on in, they take care of you. You don't have to think about food or sleep, or you know what I'm saying? They meet all your needs for that 24, 25 hour period. And so, or 24-hour period. It's just really important to understand that it's a safe place. And then they can immediately also say, okay, this is the best option. If you're a teenager and one of your friends says some of these things, take them to this place,
Well, they have to be over 18 years old.
To be over 18. But that gives you time to contact the parents or whatever and let them know what's going on, I think that's another one. The next one is a lot of you may not be aware of the Speedy Foundation, but there was an athlete. I think he was a pole vaulter at Timberline. He was very successful
here in Boise. For those of you who aren't in the Boise area,
listening to the Boise area, but he was at a local high school in Boise. He's a very successful athlete, and people loved him. And his nickname was Speedy, right? Because he's real fast. And what happened, though, is he committed suicide. And this was really, so they become an international foundation now. It's grown so big. So the family founded this foundation in his name, his memory. It's called the Speedy Foundation. They offer all kinds of education and training, and it's for any age. So at any time, you can go to their website and give them a phone call, and you could say, I want to get training on what's going on and know how you can help your close friend in high school, your college buddy, your, anybody that needs help. You can point them to the Speedy Foundation. They are easy to find on the internet and get their phone number, give them a call, whatever needs.
Yeah. And the last resource we wanted to kind of call out just in this podcast, there's a lot that Connection is the Cure has available. So this is just kind of the top 4 we're wanting to talk about today, but they have a lot more than this.
There's a lot more.
There's the Idaho Lives Project, which they are kind of a mission. They have a mission to foster resiliency throughout the schools. We talked about this, where there's sort of this idea that a social contagion, where if one suicide happens, it can kind of propagate throughout the school because it robs them of hope and a lack of desire to continue because they see that, right?
Yes.
And so their mission is basically to kind of bulk up your resiliency of the youth in the Idaho schools. Strength programs, especially in the secondary schools, they do trainings and education that are all taught by professionals, and it's a state-funded program that's really focused on this, and I think that's really cool that the state's also behind it to try to make sure that we're battling this epidemic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think these are 4 great resources. We have some resources of counselors and things that have been connected to us on the foothills.org website, which are additional ones. Connectionisthecure.org also has additional resources. So the biggest things we really want to get across in this podcast, I think, are there are options. If you or somebody you know is struggling with suicidal thoughts, there are options. And if you've lost someone to suicide, there's options, right? And we want to make sure that you're aware of that. Obviously, that 988 number is kind of the first stop if you're on the verge. But I mean, there's just so many things that there are options, and there's a reason to.
Options are hope.
Yeah, and hope is so important.
Yep.
We want to make sure that we get you connected to those. And I think there's just so many ways that you have to realize that Satan's going to use this as an opportunity to rob you, right? You don't want Satan to have this playground in your mind. That the whole reason we started with the first 4 weeks was talking about you are loved, you have identity, all these things is because ultimately, yes, there are biological clinical proclivities to this, but you have to have the hope. And the hope is that you are loved, you are known, you are here for a purpose, and those things matter. And Satan's going to try to first convince you that those things are lies.
Yeah.
And that's what starts escalating you the people around you into a potential choice into suicide. So we want to make sure that you recognize that there is a spiritual component, but we also want to offer these help options, these resources that can help you. And being in community is so important, right?
Yeah.
That's the other thing with Connection is the Cure is it's not even just connecting you to resources, it's also connecting you to other people who are struggling, right? Because people isolated and alone are way more likely to make this choice than if they are in a community, fighting together, being supported by each other. And this isn't just a thing you do by yourself. You do it in community. Obviously, you do it as a believer. You don't do this with your own strength. You actually rely on God's strength. And we want to make sure that you know that no emotion lasts forever.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when you're seeing people getting close to this choice, whether it's you or someone you love, it's because it's a wave that they feel like they're drowning underneath, right?
Yeah.
They feel like they can't ever get out from underneath it. But no matter what, no emotion ever lasts forever. And so, like you said, if you can hold out through that time, 90% of the time, that wave will pass and you'll never want to approach that again.
Yeah.
So,
and that doesn't diminish the pain of your suffering.
Yeah, don't hear us saying your suffering, is you just got to
it's
buckle
light.
down.
Yeah,
right?
it's not a light thing.
But
we're just saying that even in the darkest time, there is hope. So hang on.
Keep hanging on. Obviously, we want to make sure that you hear that this podcast is not meant to be a replacement for medical advice. We're just offering resources. This is for informational purposes only. We're not here to try to diagnose, treat, or prevent or cure any condition or disease. We need to make sure we know that as intelligent as Pastor Doug is, that is not what he's claiming. Instead, this is informational, and we want to make sure you're seeking medical advice. Obviously, we've said this a couple times, but if you or someone you know is experiencing suicidal thoughts or a crisis, please make sure you reach out to the suicide prevention hotline at 988, or there's this really cool new thing called the crisis text line. So if you're not good on the phone, don't want to talk to someone on the phone, you can actually just text, and that's just home to 741-741.
Oh, that's so cool.
And that allows you, if you have, social anxiety and you can't talk to someone, but texting is easier for you, that's an option as well. So I think that's super important. And those are both free and confidential. You don't have to worry about getting caught up in the money of it. So they're there to help. So I just absolutely, I know this was a hard topic to prep for, Pastor. I know that this is a hard topic to discuss. It's a very different topic than we normally cover. But again, we're not ones to run away from hard things, right?
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that we are doing what we can to make an impact on this thing that is affecting so many people in our country. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Make sure you tune in on Sunday. We're actually going to have September here at Foothills, and Pastor Doug and September are going to have a conversation about suicide and other aspects we didn't cover on the podcast. So if you are wanting to learn more, educate yourself, that's going to be a great message for you to tune in to. So make sure you tune in on Sunday for that. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you next Tuesday here on the Salty Pastor Podcast.
Blessings.